So today is lesson 6, and we're back in our synchronous Monday WebEx classroom after we had an asynchronous class last week accounting for Thanksgiving. So today we're going to talk about today, and then carrying on after reading week, which is next week. In 2 weeks, we're going to resume. We're going to talk about web application security. So starting off today with our poll, just asking you to list words or phrases that come to mind when you think about web application security. So it looks like our three things top of mind would be password protection with hashing, as well as HTTPS for encryption. And we see some other things that we'll have to think about: validation and encryption of data. We think about denial of service attacks, reCAPTCHA for bots, VPNs, preventing SQL injection, cryptography, protecting logins, managing SQL, and other attacks. So we're going to deal with maybe not all of these things, but we're going to deal with a number of them. So feel free to add to the word cloud as things come up today. So let's have a look at what we want to do today. So we're going to go over some fundamentals about web application security. We're going to talk about the OWASP project, which is an important initiative for you to have some awareness of. We're not going to do a deep dive. We'll just take a quick look at it. And then we're going to start to introduce the Asp.NET Identity security library, which is a number of packages that come with a lot of pre-built functionality that, as you can imagine, we can leverage and customize. And then we're going to take our online bookstore and we're going to implement security measures. First, we're going to implement basic authentication, and then we'll enhance that by adding a second level of security with role-based access control through authorization. So we'll be using the identity library to do this. Now, last week's class was a little bit different because we weren't together. So hopefully everybody had a chance to go through. I tried to make the videos not too long. It shouldn't have been more than about, I think, 80 minutes at the most, maybe less, to go through all the customizations of the MVC files so that we could really kind of take the scaffolding that Visual Studio gave us and convert it into something that's much closer to a production-ready web application. It's not totally there, but we've moved much more in that direction. If you need that code, you can get it off of GitHub. You will, of course, have to connect to your own database. Now, your Azure credits. Yes, Jacob said Azure, you are not the only person whose Azure's description has been disabled. So how are we going to manage this? For today, yes, if your subscription is disabled, just leave it. I will download your code, scaffold it with the local database, and run it. So there's not much that you can do if you've disabled it. We will have an alternative moving forward. There is an option. Student found and sent me this link, which we can try. I think it's called smarterasp.net. I wouldn't sign up for this right now because we're not going to need this until we get to assignment 3. But these guys give you a 60-day free trial, which should be enough. And I've had a couple students host their applications here. So it'd be okay to migrate or port over your code that you did in assignment 2. You can maybe move it here for assignment 3, but you don't need to worry about this right now. Okay, I'll give you the link, but it's only 60 days, so I wouldn't sign up for this service just yet. Maybe we'll wait and we'll look at this after reading week. Okay, so don't stress. If your Azure credits have run out, it's happened to a lot of people. So we will, not ideal, but we will find a workaround. So we've kind of introduced some of the key components that we're going to be looking at when it comes to web security. I do want to introduce this project, this initiative called the OWASP Top 10. This would be a great interview question for a junior web application developer. Well, tell me what the OWASP project is. Has anybody heard of this before? I imagine probably not for most people. OWASP would be new. Okay, I may have mentioned it briefly last semester, Megan. It's possible. So the OWASP project, it's a not-for-profit foundation that's trying to improve the security of software. So every few years they publish, and it stands for Open Web Application Security Project. So every few years they do a survey and they look at what are the most common vulnerabilities in web applications. Okay, so you can see here was our list 4 years ago. Here's the list for this year. So some things are more common. And what the project does is it describes what these vulnerabilities look like and also describes best practices to help prevent them. So for example, in 2021, the most common type of web application security problem is broken access control. Now, this was in 5th place 4 years ago, so it's become more common. In the survey that they found, 94% of the applications that they tested had some form of broken access control. So think about just how widespread and how prevalent that is. So, and typically, broken access control simply means that users are allowed to do things outside of what they should be allowed to do. So they mentioned some of the common problems, some of the ways that some of the things developers do wrong, and they also mentioned common remedies. So things like preventing cross-origin resource scripting, manage state with JWT. So there's sample code as well about how to do this. Okay, so we're not going to do a deep dive into this, but a number of these really common vulnerabilities are actually things that the identity framework that comes with ASP.NET are designed to prevent. So for example, it's got built-in server-side request forgery tokens, which means users cannot post data from their own forms to our own URLs because we're checking the server-side forgery. So that's baked into our .NET forms. So that link is here. We may come back and refer to it. We may or we may not, but it is something that you should be aware of. What is it? That's right, Megan. So Postman, well, let's read. Let's read exactly how that works, since you asked. Using anti-forgery tokens in our controller. So these are on by default. We can open up our project. We may as well open it up. We can actually take a quick look at this. So if we open up our last chapter project, and I'll open up, let's say, our books controller. So if I scroll down to the post method, notice it has this validate anti-forgery token annotation already here. It says to protect from overposting, enable specific properties. So we've done this. We've bound the specific properties. Actually, the scaffolding did it. But then there's a description of how does this validate anti-forgery token work. It specifies that it's looking for a token to prevent cross-site request forgery. Megan, that's a good question about Postman. We should actually be able to use Postman. Yeah, you can find a description here. So it's possible to use Postman, but we would want to include this token value. So there's a description of how to do this right in the link that gets included in our comment. Actually. Yeah, it's pretty neat, and it's all sort of transparent, so we don't really have to do a lot. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what this implementation of ASP.NET Identity is going to look like for us. So right now, our application, we've really got these two layers. We've got the blue, our MVC files up here. We've got our data SQL Server database in gray. And we're going to work with these two classes in between. We've got from the ASP.NET.Identity.Core NuGet package, we've got two classes we're interested in, the user manager and the role manager. And then when we want to talk to the database around that, we've got two stores in the library identity.entity framework. And there's a user store and a role store. So those are the primary classes that we're interested in. So what we're going to do, this is a tutorial series that you can actually find. I've included this link, and these slides are on D2L. If you want to go through the full tutorial, it's here. They start from basically creating a brand new project and then using identity for security. So I've sort of adapted this tutorial series so that we can wrap it into the last chapter bookstore that we've already created. So this tutorial is there as a reference if you wanted to refer to it. Now, when we talk about security, we need to be clear about these two concepts, authentication and authorization. They are related, but they are not the same thing. If you think back to our PHP class, we implemented authentication, but we really never got around to dealing with authorization. So how would you explain very simply, again, great job interview question, what's the difference between authentication and authorization? How would you define those? Try and use your own words, not Google's words. Okay, so yes, Mason, which one is that? Making sure that someone's allowed in. Yeah, so thanks, Ivan. Yeah, so that's authentication. Okay, and what about authorization? How would you define authorization? Just in really simple terms. Well, Ivan, that would actually be that would be authentication. One way of thinking about it is, right. Thanks, Jacob. Authorization is finding out if someone is allowed to do something. So authentication is around, here it is visually, authentication is around identity. Who is the user? And typically they provide a username, and then some kind of authentication type. So it might be, for example, a username and password stored in our local database. It might be a social account like a Microsoft or a Google account. So that's that first level is authentication. We just want to know who is this person using our application. And some applications, that's all they do. That's all we did with our PHP site. We only enabled authentication. There were two kinds of users. There were authenticated users who logged in, and there were anonymous users who hadn't logged in. So authorization is that second level. It's once you've authenticated yourself and we know who you are, it's then looking at what roles or what group or groups are you a member of. Those groups define your permissions, your access to resources, what you can see and what you can't, or what you can modify and what you can only view. So in the identity framework, it uses this principal object that combines an identity with one or more roles. So user identities as well in ASP.NET, they're not restricted to a single role. So one user can have membership in different roles within one application. I mean, let's just go and take a look at, if you look at your week 6 folder in D2L for a moment, just from looking at my screen, there are some visual cues here that this application is performing both authentication and authorization. What kind of visual cues can you see on my screen that would indicate some kind of either authentication or authorization logic? Okay, so for example, I've got permissions to upload or create documents or edit, right? If you look at this exact same page, you don't see those options. So that's authorization at work. We can all be loading the same URL, but each one of us, in each one of us, D2L in the background, the server-side script is checking what permission level does this user have? And it will show or hide various components, like these little drop-down arrows, for example, the ability to turn things on and off, right? So there's a whole lot of logic running on this page, a whole lot of authorization checks that determine what is shown and what is hidden, depending on the user's access level. We can also see the authentication piece up here, right? That it shows our identity and grabs our first name, last name, and if you have an avatar from your profile, it'll show up here, regardless of your authorization level. So up here, this is performing an authentication check, and many of these other components are performing, there's an authorization check that's being performed. Now, when we set up our project and we chose individual user accounts for authentication, ASP.NET, we got this migration file generated automatically in the project under data and migrations. It starts with all zeros, and the name is create identity schema. So this migration created all these tables that start with the word ASP.NET in the database. This is actually what they look like and how they're all related. Now, we don't need most of these tables for our purposes. We're really only interested in 3. We're going to use 3 of these tables. We've got an ASP.NET roles table. So this table is empty, but this is where we would define whatever roles we will have in our application. So in our bookstore, we're going to wind up with 2 roles that we'll create a bit later. We're going to create an administrator role, and we're going to create a customer role. So the administrators obviously can manage the store catalog, and they would be able to view all of the orders that get made. The customer would only be able to view the catalog and would be able to create orders. And then they can view orders, but they should only be able to view their own orders. They can't view everyone's. We've got an Asp Net Users Table. So this is where the accounts are stored. And then we have this junction table because users and roles are in a many-to-many relationship. One user can be in many roles, and one role can have many users. So we've got this Asp Net User Rules table that serves as this junction or bridge between the two. We'll use the Asp Net user logins later. This is for third-party logins. We probably won't need the claims or tokens table. Excellent question, Mason. I would say no, because for a few reasons. Let's go to the NuGet site. So number one is they keep these packages, they're updated quite a bit, number one. So Microsoft devotes a lot of resources to these packages. They have a huge security team. And unlike open source software, I mean, this is Microsoft's proprietary software. Mind you, I'm not sure what the license on it is now, but they devote a lot of resources to this. Does that mean it's absolutely foolproof? No. Is anything absolutely foolproof? No. Okay. But the products are mature. They've been around for a long time. And there's a lot of resources that go into them. But excellent question. So what we're going to do, we've already got these tables in our database, right? If I go and open and have a look at my database, when we ran our initial migration, a few weeks ago to build out the database, that create identity schema migration ran. So we actually have all these tables here already. So they're all here, along with the 5 tables that we created together. So we don't need to write a lot of code because a lot of the infrastructure is already baked into it. So we're primarily concerned with using a few objects. We're going to use the identity user object for authentication, and that's kind of mapped to the Asp Net Users Table. We've also got the identity role, which is mapped to the Asp Net User Rules Table, and that class is used for doing authorization, role-based access control. We'll have to make a couple small changes in our startup file. So every time the application gets launched, this code runs. So we'll make a few small changes there. And then first, we're going to do authentication checking, similar to what we did in PHP. We're simply going to check, is our user anonymous or are they logged in? And we want to control access to some resources. We can do it either at a controller level or we can do it at an individual method level. If we want to make it available only to someone who's logged in, we just use the authorize command. And then if we want to override it, let's say we make our whole controller private, but we want to make one method public, which we'll do. We could use the allow anonymous annotation for a single method. That would mean everything in the controller, only a logged in user could see, except one method would be available to anybody. And then if we want to do authentication checking in our view, we could use code similar to this. We just check the user identity object, and that object has a property called isAuthenticated. That'll obviously return a Boolean. So we could show or hide things like links in our navbar, depending on whether our user is signed in or not. So we're going to implement that first. And then we'll implement authorization. So once we can do the basic identity checking, we'll enable the role-based access control, where we'll add on to that initial authorized decorator, where we would then specify a role or list of roles that would have access. And then we'll rewrite the code again in our view to support authorization checking. Instead of just checking if our user is authenticated, we can check if the user is in a specific role in order to see a block of HTML or have access to a feature. So I'll come back and reference some things in here, but this is where we want to go with our application today. So if you don't have your project open, make sure you open it up. And let's get it launched. So you can see the changes that I made. I customized the look last week in our lesson videos. I picked a color theme using the Google Material Palette. I've added a Google font. What else did we do? I added alternating background colors and also enabled the ability to upload images. I've resorted the drop-down lists on create and edit into alphabetical order. So if you missed any of this, you can go through it. The lessons on video, the code is on GitHub, the lessons on YouTube, the code is on GitHub. You should go through though and get used to making these changes. We added column sorting. As well as some logic to display a little placeholder image if the book had no image of its own. So I made a bunch of changes to the style sheet, a bunch of changes to the layout file. I also changed this page so that the default sort order is first by author and then by title. Megan, most of them shouldn't have important. Off the top of my head, if it does have important and you wanted to overwrite it, I would probably just define my own class with a different name and change that class on that element. There may be a better way of doing it, but that would be my workaround. Don't use that class from Bootstrap. Just define your own. There may be a better way of doing it, but that workaround. Well, you could assign a class to it with your own style if you want to style it. Right. What I'm saying is you could define your own class and then assign that class to the P element. In the HTML, you'd need to do P class equals my paragraph and then define my paragraph in the style sheet. There may be a better way of doing it, but I think that would work. So what we've got right now is everything in our site, like basically the books and categories, these controllers and views that we've scaffolded, they're all here, but the purpose of everything we've created so far is really for the site administrator, isn't it? We don't want the public to be able to add, edit, and delete categories, and books. So we want to control access, but we'll first just add an authentication check. So right now, everything on our site is public, and we'll want to change it so that everything on our site, you can't change anything unless you're actually logged in. Once we have that working, then we will add the role-based access control to it. So the first thing we're going to do, we have to make one change to the default configuration of our site. So in your Solution Explorer, if you open up startup.cs, it's the file at the very bottom of the project. Open that up. We have not touched this file, so everyone's file should look exactly the same. The line numbers in my project should be exactly the same as the line numbers in your project. We need to change one thing here on line 35. So this is code that configures ASP.NET Identity to manage users in this identity user class. Can you see anything on line 35 that we should change? It's just a small change. So line 35 of your startup file. You can take a guess if you want. You need to modify one small thing here. What might that be? Yeah, exactly, Chris. Right now, so the default option when a new account is created, the account isn't active. It's going to send an email with a confirmation link, and the user is going to have to click that link to verify their account before they can log in. We're going to disable this because we don't have an active mail server to do this. So if we leave this enabled, we're never going to be able to have a fully active account. So I'm going to toggle that from true to false. In a production application, you probably want that feature enabled, but we don't have access to a mail server right now. So we're just going to set that to false. We're not going to worry about that. Pardon me. So our site is already by default set up to handle authentication. It's set up to manage user identities. So let's go and actually create an account. So if you go to the register form, click it, you're going to get this pre-built registration page. If we want to make changes to it, we could. We'll leave it for now. We're going to create an admin account first. And we're all going to use the same set of credentials. That way, nobody has to remember them. You come to class in a couple of weeks and you go, hey, I can't remember how to log into the site as an administrator. Well, yes, you can, because we're all going to use the same login. So here's the login. I'll put it in the chat as well. It's admin@gc.ca, nice and simple. Our password will be test123$. So there's built-in rules around strong passwords. I think the default is a minimum of 6 characters, although we can change that. It will require at least an uppercase character, at least one lowercase character, 1 digit, 1 special character. So I'm going to put that in the chat. I recommend if we all just use the same credential, then nobody has to bother trying to remember it. So you can see if I put in less than 6 characters, it tells me. And let's say I just put in, I'll just put in for now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just so you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If I try this, it'll do the regex checking for me. It says I need a special character, I need a lower, I need an upper. The code is also here to do duplicate checks. So it's not going to allow us to sign up to register 2 accounts with the same email address. That feature, again, already baked into the framework. So I'll go ahead and create my account. And we can kind of tell that this worked. How can we tell? Other than the fact that we didn't get an error, there's a visual cue here that that registration attempt was successful. Yeah, thanks, Quentin. You got it, right? The register and login links, yeah, exactly, Adam. As well, the register and login links are hidden. And now it says hello, it's got our username and log out. If I go to Management Studio and create a query, I can just click on it and I just change it to my last chapter database. It's like running a used command. Just pick it in the dropdown. If I execute it, we can see okay, it looks like somebody's using my database, which is not ideal. Whatever. Probably best you connect to your own database. So here's my user account, and my ID is a long kind of random string. It uses a GUID to generate this string. And the password is hashed. It's also salted, which helps ensure uniqueness. Okay, so now I've got one user account. So what happens here in the nav bar? Where did that come from? If we go and look at the code that was scaffolded under views and shared, a few of you in week 3 were examining this login partial file, and you were looking at the code at the top. So there's the sign-in manager is checking if the user is signed in. Then the first link says hello, and then the user.identity.name, and then there's the logout button. When the user is anonymous, we see those register and login links that we've been looking at for 5 weeks. So I can log out. Now I can try their login button. I should be able to log back in with those credentials. Again, register and log out disappear. Hello, admin, and log out reappear. So that logic's already kind of baked in to the project. So the register and login are already functional. We didn't have to do anything. The only thing we had to do was disable that sending of the confirmation email that's coded in that startup file. So we toggled true to false and it works, which is pretty neat, I think. But just because we can register and log in, that doesn't mean there's any kind of authentication checking being done in the actual project. So here I am in Firefox, right? I can go to categories, browse around, I can add, edit, and delete. I can go to books, and I can do the same. I can add books, I can delete them. So that's all working. I'm just going to open up, go to Chrome. So in Firefox, I'm now logged in. Chrome, I'm anonymous, right? We see register and log in. There's no username being shown here. Yet, I still have access to go everywhere within books and categories. So we want to change this. We want to add a simple authentication check so that only a user who is logged in can get anywhere within the categories or the books. So we're going to go first to our categories controller. So open up that file. So we have really granular access control if we want it. We can set different access rules on each individual method in the controller, or we could control access at the controller level itself. That's going to be simpler, so let's do that. So on line 13, we've got our class declaration, Our categories controller inherits from the base MVC controller class. Oops. Did not mean to do that. I meant to do that. We're going to make all methods private. So all we need to do here is add the decorator, the annotation on the class of authorize. When I do this, Visual Studio complains. It wants us to make a reference to Microsoft.ASP.NET-Core.authorization. So we're going to need to reference this library. So I'll just click the reference. Gets added up here. And authorize turns blue. So what's the result of this going to be? What the result of this should be is now in Firefox where I'm logged in, I should still be able to get to any of the category pages. In Chrome, I shouldn't be able to get to any of them because in Chrome, I'm unidentified. I'm an anonymous user. So add the authorize decorator above your class definition. Accept the reference to Microsoft.ASP.NET-Core.authorization. And now I'm going to try this out in both browsers. I'm still logged in here. Whoops, got to restart my server. So in Firefox, where I'm logged in, I can still create, edit, delete, no problem. I'm going to try those same things in Chrome. So I'm anonymous here. When I go to categories, you can see now I get redirected to the login with the return URL of category. So if I log in, it'll authenticate me and it'll take me back to the page that I requested before. What if I try to go to, let's say, categories/create? Same thing, still stuck here for categories/delete/2. Doesn't matter where I try to go, that authentication check runs at the class level. So any method inside, any new methods we write as well, we put them inside of that class, they're automatically going to require authentication. Pretty simple. Now there's one method in here that maybe we can make public. So we've got 5 methods in the controller. We've got create, we've got index, edit, details, delete. Which one do you think would be safe to make public? Yeah, Quinn, I agree. The details, right? Because on details, it's just read only. It just shows the name. But the user can't add, they can't edit, they can't delete. So if we want to make the details method only, we want to make that public, we can easily override the class level authentication rule. So I'll just scroll down. The details method starts on my line 32. It's probably the same line number for you, maybe a little different, but it will be around line 32. So here we can just allow anonymous. That's it. That will make only this one method public. You have to be logged in to access index, create, edit, or delete. The details will let you into. So now if I go back to Chrome, scroll up so the code's here. So you can see allow anonymous is here right above the details method header. So in Chrome, where I'm anonymous, I can now, should be able to go to categories/details, put in an ID number. So I have permission here. Change. Soon as I click edit, right, I don't have permission to call edit. So it bounces me back to the login screen. Yeah, we could. What we'll do later, we're going to build a separate categories index. So what we're going to do, this category list will only be for the administrators. We will make a separate page that's formatted entirely differently with the list of categories for the customers or the shoppers. So it'll still be populated with the same query data, but we'll make a new page that's formatted totally separately. So yes, Megan, we are going to get there. That's probably the last thing we'll do today, is we'll build that out. So just to show you, actually, I guess I could pull up one of the projects from, say, my Thursday section. So just to give you an idea what that looks like. I'll show you. So my Thursday class, we're building a pet store. Tuesday class, we're building a food shop. So where are we going at the end of today? Well, I'll show you. So we'll have a shop link here. And notice when I'm not logged in, I can't even see the categories link. We'll deal with that in a minute. I go to shop. And I've got this card view where I can click. So we'll give this kind of a view to the customers. And we can keep just the simple scaffolded view for the administrator. So this is kind of where we'll get to a little later today. Okay, so we have to do one other tiny little thing with this authentication check, and then we'll take a break. So we've controlled access here properly. When I'm an anonymous user, the only place I can get to is the details. I know it's a bit of a contrived example because the only way I can get there is to type the URL. But there's one other small authentication measure we should take. There's still something here as a Chrome user that isn't quite right. So I'm an anonymous user in Chrome. What other change should we make? The access control is working, but we have to take care of one other little detail. It has to do with a visual element on the page. Thanks, Megan. Right? If I don't have access to the categories because I'm not logged in, I shouldn't even see this link. So what we want to do is wrap this link in the layout file in a little if statement. So what is that if statement going to look like? We're going to check if our user identity property is authenticated. So we'll go to the layout file. And down here on lines 28 to 30, there's our categories link. So we want to wrap this inside of an if condition. If user.identity is authenticated. And I'm just going to drag that li inside. Oops. Yep, there we go. Sorry, just 1 second. Sorry about that. So now my link should only show up when my user is logged in. So when I'm logged in Firefox, I've got my link. And in Chrome, now notice my link is gone. Because I'm not authenticated, I don't see that categories link. If I log out in Firefox, as soon as I click log out, the categories link's going to disappear. If I log in, it will reappear as soon as I'm authenticated. So I log out, link is gone. I log back in, link comes back. Okay, so we've really added very, very little here. We've made one change and added 3 lines of code in the whole project to get this to work. So there's our authentication checking. Sure, absolutely. So these lines were already here. The li tag with the a, I just wrapped it in the if statement that starts on line 28. So if we want to show or hide HTML, depending on whether our user is logged in or not, we just use that if statement on line 28. The user.identity.isAuthenticated. This does not deal with authorization at all. There's no roles and permissions here. This is simply around authentication. Is the user known or are they anonymous? So this is kind of level 1. Yes, I would agree. Wholeheartedly. Okay, it is 5 to 2. So what I'm going to do is I will push this stuff up to GitHub. So if you missed anything or you need to check your code against mine, the latest version will be here. And then what we will do when we come back after we take a 10-minute break is we're then going to want to implement that second level. We want to actually move from just simple authentication checking to authorization checking, where we can have different users and those users have the ability to see and do different things. Okay, so we will do that. I imagine we should not be much past 3 p.m. today. Okay, we will come back in 10. I'll push my stuff up to Git now.